So, hello everyone, and welcome to another virtual DDD, where whatever time zone it is for you. So today with us is Marco from the organizers, and today we're going to discuss about DDD in the front end. And we have Francesco with us. He will give a 30-minute presentation, and afterwards we're going to openly discuss it within Zoom. So everyone who's watching from YouTube, please feel free to chat away. Everyone's muted until that time. And well, Francesco, welcome. Maybe a small introduction before you start, and then we can go.
Okay. This evening I will be going to talk about domain-driven frontend and how, if you want, how to implement some of the domain-driven design technique in a front-end application. And okay, I can start because I have also some code to show. So I'm really curious about what you think about it. Okay, I can share my screen. Give me a moment. Okay, you should see my slides. Okay, perfect. So let's have this talk called domain-driven frontend. And but before starting talking about domain-driven design of frontend, I need to talk a little bit about myself to explain to you why I'm making this talk. I am Francesco Strazzullo. I'm from Italy, and my code name is Straz. Is the way that everyone is calling me from when I was a child. And currently, I'm a partner, a developer in Flowing. Flowing is a full remote company in Italy. This is a software delivery company. And you can see my Twitter handle on the slide. And this is the only, sorry, I need to move this stuff. Okay, it's the only social network that I use to talk about code and IT in general. I use Facebook to talk about Italian politics, so I don't think that you want to talk with me on Facebook. Okay, so let's start. I started working in JavaScript in a front-end application in 2009. And before that, I worked for 6 or 7 years as a Java developer. Okay, I worked in the Java enterprise ecosystem at the time. And so I always floated between these two worlds in the last 10 years. I became a better front-end developer, a JavaScript developer. But in the meantime, I continued to study back-end technologies. And of course, I studied the two main DDD books, the blue one and the red one, about how to implement domain-driven design. Well, fast forward in 2015, this is a screen for a famous talk for the front-end ecosystem. That is live React auto-reloading with time travel at React Europe 2015 by Dan Amaroff. Then this is the talk that introduced Redux to the front-end world. And if you don't know about Redux, it was very cool stuff at the time, but it was it was a framework based on events and reducers and immutable events and so on. So after a while, I started using Redux in production, but after a while, I just thought about, okay, we are talking about Redux, but the main concepts are the same of event sourcing. Of course, there are differences, okay? We don't have a database, we don't have a log of events because it's everything on the front end. But the main idea, it's quite similar, that the state of an application can only be changed by an event. And the events are immutable objects that thrive through the application. Well, fast forward again to present day, and today, micro frontends are a very hot stuff in the front-end world, okay? We are using the same pattern of the microservices also to the front-end application, creating micro frontends that communicate each other with various kind of integration and event-driven architecture. As you can see, I showed to you two different architectural frameworks that are bounded to DDD concepts. And so I discovered that front-end and DDD communities don't talk to each other too much. There is any talk about DDD in the front-end conferences. I can assure you, because I made a lot of talk about JavaScript in conferences, and I never listened to a talk about DDD. But also, if you go to DDD conferences, there are not so much talk about front-end. Okay, the DDD literature is about back-end development. Okay. So why I'm here? I'm here to solve this problem. I want to start talking about DDD to front-enders and vice versa, okay? I made a similar talk to a front-end community. And right now I'm doing this talk to a DDD community. So I'm trying to merge these two worlds little by little, okay? But this is my point. What this talk will be about? I will try to implement in a very, very simple demo project the right part of the chart that you see in this slide, the tactical part of DDD. I will talk about entities, value objects, services, aggregates, and domain events with a very, very simple application. I don't think that everything from the DDD can be translated as is to the front-end world, because I think that, of course, the domain is equally important on the back-end and on the front-end, but the front-end is a quite particular ecosystem, because sometimes you need to work with user inputs. It is not so easy to adapt everything from the DDD. For example, we will see an implementation of an invariant in my code that is quite different from the implementation that you can do in a backend application. So the code is coming. All the code that I will show, it's available on GitHub. You can see the link in the slide, github.com flowingis/DDD frontend. But before I start, I have a little disclaimer for this talk. I use JavaScript for the application. I decided to not use TypeScript. And I did it for two main reasons. The first one is that all the stuff that you will see is based on a true story about a refactoring process that my team and I made on a real world application. My application will be in React, okay, because I don't want to get mad, but the real application one was made in Backbone.js, a very, very old JavaScript framework, but the concepts are still the same. But apart from the historical version of my problem, I decided to use JavaScript also for another reason. I want to show to you that it is entirely possible to work with domain-driven design also without types, also in a dynamic language. And what I mean is that it's quite easy to introduce some DDD techniques in any code base. You don't need types or classes or whatever you want. You just need some plain old JavaScript to do that. So code time. Okay, let's show the code. Before showing the code, I would like to show the outcome of the application, okay? It's a very, very simple list of employees. Imagine that I am a manager, and I can just click here to decide who to promote to, I don't know, tech lead in my company, okay? The list is always random. We have a random data generator, But this is the simple use case that I want to show you, okay? Okay, let's start with the basic code. So I have a classic React application. And my React application use an employees repository, an employees repository to load the data. So I just call the list method, I wait for the return of the data, and then I just put the employees on the state. This is all React jargon, okay? It's just a way to make a request at the beginning of the life cycle of the component, and then to put the data in the state when the data arrive from the server, okay? And then I just print my employees on the DOM with the app content component, okay? It's not important for the talk. It's just, okay, print a list with a UL alive. I don't care. When I click on the promote, when I click on the heart icon, what I do is that I update my local state, so on my front end, and then I call the employee repository to promote my employee to the server, okay? So I want to show you my employee repository. It's not a real repository, it's just fake data. There is no server involved in any case. But what I show to you is that usually front-end developers don't call this kind of objects repository. They call, for example, APIs. They call employees APIs. But if you look at the at what they do, they are actually repositories, because a repository, I keep notes on the right, is just an object with a purpose to store and retrieve entities. Its form should be independent from the data source. And it is what I did here in this repository. This is just a dummy repository. It does not do anything, but its form is promise-based, and it's independent from the data source. When I will implement with a real repository with a REST API, for example, I will not change anything about my component. And this is the entire point of repository. Then I want to let you think about another stuff. When you work with frontend, you work with JSONs, okay? Usually from a RESTful API. Well, usually, if your REST API are well built, JSON are entities, because an entity is an object defined primarily by its identity that can change over time. And the JSON is actually an object defined primarily by its identity that can change over time. What I mean with this first very, very stupid example is that front-enders are using some DDD techniques every day, but they don't talk the same language of the backenders. It may seem a stupid example, but when in a team, I start to call my objects like the DDD counterpart on the backend, people start talking each other more frequently. So let's go over. Like I said, this is I'm simulating a refactoring process. So now I will simulate a more complicated example, okay? So as you can see here now, the application remained the same, but sometimes I get an error. I get an error because when I want to promote someone, I need to check the peer review, the review received from that particular employee. If the reviews that the employee received from their peers, it's less than 3, oh, sorry, less than 4, then I just stop the execution. Then if I have more than 3 reviews, I calculate the average. And if my average is less than 7, I cannot promote the employee. Okay, this is simple and another simple example, but imagine that you have a very, very complex application full of these kind of boundaries, and every boundary is written in the component itself. This stuff is completely untestable, and it's not related to the UI at all. It's a domain problem. The funny stuff is that on the back-end application, usually this stuff is well written outside controllers. If you work with Spring, outside the REST controller, but it's put in the right place, okay, or at least not in the controller itself. But on the front end, usually these kind of controls are made directly in the UI. So as a team, we started to tackle this problem for our client. And the first thing that we did was to add a service. So I removed, as you can see, the business logic from the UI, from the app, and I put everything in an object called employee service. The employee service, I just moved the code from the application to the service. It just do the exact same thing, okay? The list method is just a wrapper around employees repository. And the promote method just call the review repository to get the reviews, and that make the same exactly controls, and everything is correct. It invokes the employee repository. There is an anti-pattern here about the repository. If you see, the promote method needs to know obviously about the employees, but also about the set employee method from React. This is a first step, okay? And we had the similar problem in Backbone. The service needed to know about a bit stuff about the UI because it's a first implementation, okay? But if you're looking at this code from an high level point of view, you can see that it's actually a service like in DDD. A service is an object that orchestrates a step required to fulfill the commands imposed by the client. In standard DDD, there are three different kinds of system services: domain, application, infrastructure. However, I find that most of the time, this classification loses some of its importance in the front-end application. Okay, it's blurry in a front end where the application and the infrastructure comes together, okay? It's hard to separate, in my opinion, application from infrastructure, sorry. So we have a first step, okay? We created a service. It's not perfect, it's not a perfect solution, but still now I can test my code in an isolated environment, okay? I just needed to mock the employee repository. Notice that my employee service actually depends directly on the employee repository. I voluntarily did not implement a dependency injection mechanism to make the code more readable for this case, okay? I know that is a bad smell, but in the real world application, I will create factories to inject dependency inside, okay? So I can mock easily employees repository when I test employee service. But like I said, it was just the first step. Our first step was to move everything up from the UI and to start talking about services that uses a repository to make operations. Well, the next step is to introduce the aggregates. Okay, let's start from the app.js. And as you can see, this time, I completely separated the service from React set employees because I just depend on promote. Sorry. I just depend on to promote parameter, okay? Then I have the result, and my result has a type attribute that can give me the type of error that I received from my service. For example, if my result type is not enough reviews, then I just print a window alert. I know it's ugly to use window alert. It's just for the sake of the example, okay? Be kind. If my result type is ranking too low, then I print another window alert. Otherwise, I extract the employee from the result and I do the React magic. I just write a new state from my application, but the state comes from my service. The service use an employee aggregate factory to create an aggregate and to promote them. Then, if the result type is okay, there are no errors, then I sync my state with the server with a repository. So let's take a look at the aggregate. The aggregate contains a bit of JavaScript jargon because I need to make the object immutable in order to use it as a real aggregate, okay? The problem with JavaScript is that if you create a simple object, the object is by default immutable, okay? What I want to do with the promote method that I will show in a moment is that anybody can change the promote attribute apart from the aggregate itself, okay? So I need to create a little of threads, cloning objects, and something like that. It may seem a little harder to read for non-JavaScript developer, but after a while, it makes sense. So let's take a look at the promote method of the aggregate. I just put the same code as before inside the aggregate, but this time I returned an object and not just throwing an error. This is what I talked about before. This is what it's called usually an invariant, okay, in an aggregate. A rule that should never be broken. But while probably in Java I will use, throw new error. In a front-end application, I will suggest to not use an error, because if you throw an error, it's very, very hard to catch, to understand what happens on the front end, because you want to gracefully show the error to the user usually. On the back-end application, it could be simpler, because I throw an error and I convert that error in a bad request response. On the front end, it could be a little trickier to manage error. So if my invariants are passed, then I create a copy of my aggregate, setting the promoted to true. So I change the state of my aggregate, and then I return it. So in this way, I completely isolated my domain in an aggregate, and I can test the promote method in isolation. Well, it's not enough, because as part of this refactoring process, also the backend has made some DDD implementation. And on the backend, we were using an event-driven architecture, okay? So we said, okay, why don't we create a specular event-driven architecture on the front end, so we can have homomorphic events on the front end and on the back end. So the last step is to add an event bus to the mix. Okay, the only difference between this example and the first and the previous one is that now I have an event bus used inside my service, and then I create events in the aggregate. I release these events, and for each event, I just publish on the event bus. The event bus, it's quite simple, okay? I have a map of event types. I have a list of subscribers. I have just a simple subscribe method, and I have a publish method that invoke all the subscriber. Right now, I just have one subscriber that just print a console log, but in the real application, we use the subscriber to connect different parts of the front-end application, and also to send some of these events. If I remember correctly, it was the events marked with online. It was an online property in the events. Send these events to the backend with a socket. The backend get the data from the socket, update its state, and then send an event to the client, and the client updates its states. The aggregate now just take also an events, you create an events array, and when I promote this employee, I just push an event inside my array. When I release the events, I clone the events, I clear up my events, and return the cloned events outside. Everything is immutable from the outside. And that's it. You can see the test of my aggregates. So I don't want to read about that because it's okay. It's what you just see in the code. But what I want to show you, it's completely testable outside of React, but also outside of the browser. This is very, very important because I can use the same exactly aggregate also on a node environment. I could take a DDD object from Node.js, for example, and putting that on the browser, or vice versa. I can take my employee aggregate that came from a browser application and put it on a Node.js application. It will work in any case in the same way. So, okay, my demo is concluded, so I will just complete my talk now. So why should you care about implementing DDD in the front end, or to know that it's possible to do that? Well, first thing first, DDD helps teams work together using the same language. We know the importance of ubiquitous language in a team, okay, to talk using the same words and vocabulary of the domain experts. But if you work with the same, using DDD, also on the front end, your backend team and your front end team can talk together using the same language about repository entities, value objects, and aggregates. On the other hand, front-end applications are becoming more and more complex by the day. And we all know that DDD help teams to tackle complexity in general. So I think that it's time for frontenders to start using DDD techniques. But I also think that sometimes backenders that are expert in DDD should start to introduce, to help their team to introduce these topics in the front-end world. Because in the end, simplicity, and I think that my code is quite simple in a way, if you know JavaScript, simplicity is the ultimate sophistication. It's not so easy to create a simple architecture, and DDD can help you to achieve that. Okay, this is a first for me. So if you're interested in the domain-driven design for the front end, I'm preparing with Scoperta a new workshop about domain-driven front end. It's in a waiting list, so I have not a date. I will not have so much content. I'm creating it. So if you're interested, just add to the waiting list and contact me. We can talk about the contents of the workshop if you want. I'm also writing a book with Scoperta. It's the first book published by Scoperta as an editor, And the book is called Decision Making for Software Developer Teams. It is a book where I'm trying to write how to help developer teams to make mindful decisions about frameworks, languages, or architectures. I prepared a special discount code for virtual DDD. It's just the link in the slide. I can send as a comment in the YouTube or here in the chat if you want. And thank you. My talk is finished in half an hour. Wow, I'm perfectly on time.
Yeah, thank you very much, Francesco.
Yes, thanks.
Okay.
Everyone's allowed to unmute themselves now. So let's open the dialogue, right? So Marco, I think you want to start, and then feel free everyone to join in, and everyone from YouTube, please feel free to ask questions.
Yeah, so yeah, I'd like to take it away with the first observation, which is something very painful, I feel, and that's the assumption that front end and domain are different things. So somehow there's the assumption that the domain is part of the back-end team or the back-end software. And this is something I've seen all over the place, right? You go to any kind of conference or you go to any company, and it's always the back-end developers who think about DDD. And in front-end, it's very rare. Sometimes there are approaches, but there's usually a cultural rift in between front-end design because it has something to do with design and user experience and the domain rules itself, when there really shouldn't be, because it's all the domain. The domain is not localized in front or back-end, right? The domain is something that exists outside of the solution we provide, and then we build a solution. So however we separate our bounded contexts, that's all part of a solution design. And of course, the domain is also in the front end, because if there's behavior, if there's language in the front end, that is not separate from the domain, and neither should the solution be. So now open question to everybody. Does anybody have experience or experimented with having the front end or behavior in the front end being designed as a bounded context, or integrating it into other bounded contexts and making front end part of another bounded context? What's your approach there, or your take on it?
I have this discussion with Kenny for years. Not sure yet. I surely cannot design anything.
Yeah, what's Francesco's take on it?
My take on this problem. I think that micro frontends are born to solve this problem. To see the backend and the front end as a unit for solving one bounded context. I have to say that today, 2021. Yes, okay, it's right here. The 2021, it's not so easy to build a micro front-end application. There is not so much literature about that, so it's more. I think I find it a little experimental yet. But when, for example, there is a book that is out in the winter about micro frontends from Luca Mezzalier. And I think that in a couple of years, we will have a lot of more tools and use cases about micro frontends. And then you can solve this problem telling that, okay, I have a separate bounded context in the backend. I have a specular application on the front end.
Interesting. Yeah. So using micro frontends basically as a solution, as an architectural solution to getting the front end design into the bounded context of a specific area without separating front and back end. Yeah, I like that. Yeah, I've experimented with 2 or 3 different things over the years, and I figured that depending on there's one it depends, right? We chatted about this in the live chat on the side, but there's one big it depends here, and that is if the user journey is very similar to the domain behavior, then the UIs or the front ends probably should be part of the respective bounded context, right? If you take something like a trivial thing like, nothing is trivial in domain-driven design, but if you take a simpler domain like cinema reservations or so, and you want to reserve a seat or you want to pay your ticket, and those are different bounded contexts, right? Having the respective user interfaces of that respective part just be part of the bounded context, so that one team can build a cohesive model for the business logic that has to be working with multiple users at the same time and also providing a good user experience for the singular user, that makes sense. On the other hand, if your user journey is very different, if you're only touching the backend, the domain slightly, now I'm making the same mistake. If you're only touching the domain slightly, but your user experience is very different. That's, for example, if you do shift planning, a domain I've been working in for many years, and if you are planning that tomorrow you do the early shift and the day after the late shift, there's immensely big domains behind that, with laws written and with optimizations for different stakeholders that the user does not care about at all. But still there's a touching there. You need to send a command in and something has to be evaluated. So in those cases, the user journey would be its own bounded context, right? And then it has nothing to do with front end or back end. You can build the whole application inside a front end or a web server, or you can build it with 1,000 microservices separating between micro front ends and micro back ends and whatever you want. That's an architecture decision that doesn't really matter.
Exactly. I have a point of this. There is also another pattern that is used in the front end. This is quite the opposite of micro front end. It's called backend for front end. I think that is used in Twitter, if I remember correctly. And in your example, what you do is that, okay, your particular use case, it's tells a very different story from your bounded context, okay? Because it's not a business rule, it's a user journey rule, okay? It could be quite different, okay?
It's still a business rule, but yeah.
Yeah, okay, but you know,
it's a different one from a different context.
It's a different one,
yeah.
It's a different context, okay? So what you can do there is to create a specific backend for that specific front end, and that specific front end use all your domain as as a port to your domain, and then you create a new domain object for your front end. Okay, so it's another way of thinking. Okay, I create small applications, separated, but separated. Really separated. One application could be a mobile app. One application could be a desktop browser app. They're really separated, not in the microservices way. That is, you can see still them as one. They're completely separate. And then you have a backend that talks the same domain language of your front end because are different bounded context. This is cool when you have very, very specific and complex interaction with the user.
Yes, I totally agree.
Another solution for the same problem could be GraphQL, for example, because it lets you to manipulate objects on the front end side directly, making queries. And these queries can come from different bounded contexts. You can expose all your domain in a GraphQL endpoint. They came from all over the world. And then you can let the front end to manipulate this data as they want.
Yeah, so here's the tricky thing that I think this is a discussion where Christina is also having. So I'm doing it that way in a sense that from a model perspective, the front end is a different consistent language, right? So you speak a different language to your customers than probably how you would solve the specific complexity, just what you see. The problem there is that you want to have teams as close to your customer as possible. And that's harder to solve in that architecture. And it's something I struggle with as well, right? Because that customer journey, then you have really that front end team that's close to the customer, but your bounded context teams, if there are multiple teams. So if it's one team, I'm in that situation now, it's fine. But as soon as you scale out and you need to split somewhere, you're splitting on bounded context, and you're saying, well, this bounded context for business complexity, let's put on one team on it and the customer journey team on the customer journey bounded context. And now the other team isn't as close to the real customer anymore.
Yeah.
It depends if how your organization is structured, right? So that other bounded context could be your users, could be the business itself. So then I'm okay with it. But if the users are still your customers in the customer journey, then that
I think
serves a problem, in my opinion.
Yeah,
so
I
it
think
depends, of course. But
sorry.
Go ahead.
I think there's a false dichotomy. I mean, I did the same, right, in the example before, but there's always this understanding that front end and domain are different things. And
they're not different.
They're not different. I mean, if you have two bounded contexts and those two bounded contexts have a different language, the one bounded context focuses on some part of the domain, the other bounded context focuses on another part, and still there is interaction going on. So you need some kind of translation, right? This pattern exists already in DDD. Now imagine that one bounded context has its own user interface, right? They represent communication with a customer, and the other bounded context doesn't. That's fine. One bounded context could be a pure user journey and then interacting with the other bounded context. Other bounded contexts could build some kind of composite UI that aggregate information from other bounded contexts even. So front end or back end are orthogonal concepts to domain and bounded contexts.
Yeah,
that's not the dichotomy here. It feels like one, and in our culture it still is, and that's a problem, I think. So if you go to, this is what Francesco said in the beginning, if you go to conferences or if you talk to front-end teams, right, they either talk about front-end design and do JavaScript and React and Vue.js and whatever, or you talk about Java and .NET in the back end and building domain models. But that is a false dichotomy. Those things shouldn't be mutually exclusive or even related. It's you build a bounded context, and whatever is in your solution model is part of your solution model. Yeah, sometimes that's pure business logic and semantics and only rules. Sometimes that is feeling, icons, sounds, smells, whatever. Some bounded contexts aren't even software, but part of a physical solution system, right? Building and a door and whatever. So it gets philosophical at some point, of course, but I wouldn't separate between front end and back end in DDD. I would specify what are we trying to solve with this bounded context. Are we trying to better the user journey? Well, then the front end part of the software is definitely part of our bounded context.
Yeah, and that was not my thing. It was more about teams, right? You want your teams as close. And I think, Christina, you wanted to pitch in because I think that's what usually our discussion is about, right? Putting your team as close to the, user of your system as possible.
Yeah. So why should some people be more near to the customer as others? How many backend developers did you see they didn't even know about the customers, or they are building huge GraphQLs for the sake of we can build it?
Yeah.
This is the biggest mistake a team can do.
Yeah,
I think a great rephrasal there would be not close to the customer, but close to the stakeholders is what bounded context developers should be. So if my stakeholders are, or if some of my stakeholders are the end users or the customers, then I should be close to them. If I'm a bounded context developer somewhere in, and now let's say for sake of argument, the back end, I'm building some rule engine that gets used by other bounded contexts, then I need to talk to those people, but not to the end user, right? So whoever the stakeholders behind a solution model are, those are the stakeholders the developers of a bounded context should talk to.
Yeah. So a perfect example here in the cinema domain, as you said, right, is you're exposing someone who could reserve a ticket for a seat and they can choose the seating. But the way you allocate that is really a business model, right? The business themselves are more concerned with how can I optimize people with the money I make for a certain thing. So that's the purpose and the model of one. And exposing that to your customer, you're more concerned with how can I give people the correct feeling of choosing each seat, which is two different purposes.
Yes, but the same goal. I'm sorry, Francesco. It's the same goal. You cannot just allocate and have the biggest, best allocation method if the customers are unhappy. Or
but then that one model has two stakeholders. One, it's the users, but also the business revenue.
Yeah, absolutely.
For example, I agree with you. It's completely a team problem, an organizational problem. Okay, I think that the Conway's law is all over the place when we are talking about this stuff. And I can make you an example. When I facilitate some, event storming or something like that, where I need to extract model from a business, the conversation changed dramatically if you put in the conversation also an UX designer or a UX researcher that talks about users and not just about domain experts, because domain experts can't see all the they can see all the domain problem, all the business problem, but they can see how this problem are perceived by the end user. If you put somebody that is, I don't know, like a user representative, okay, in the mix, your discussion change completely, and you see that sometimes the bounded context start to merge and to, okay, we are talking about the same stuff. The users are an integrating part of our domain model, and things start going differently, okay? It's more easier to use then the same model in the front end. When there is no user experience person in the mix, you know, they are like in the bubble. They are talking about their business, about their models, but not about this, how these models can be used by the people outside. I think that this is a part of the problem that we are trying to solve here.
Yeah. You were talking about sharing models between the front and the back end. So I don't know if there's, if I glanced over it or so, but is there any solution when you have, let's say you have a JavaScript front end, right? You build everything in JavaScript and maybe React. And if you also build something with Node.js and JavaScript in the backend, of course, that will be an easy thing. Then you can actually share the model. But if you have a backend in Java or .NET or any other language, or maybe even a different paradigm, you build something in Haskell, and then your front end is React and Vue.js or any of those JavaScript libraries, how would you synchronize your mental model if you really want to speak the same language?
Oh, great question. Okay, I can give you 2 examples of something that I did. I did not to synchronize backend and frontend, but to synchronize a web application, a front-end application, and a mobile application. Okay, so we have a similar problem. Okay, it's not a backend, but we have different languages, okay, because you have JavaScript and you have Java Kotlin on an Android application, okay. In one case, we've wrapped the JavaScript application in Java with Longor, Rhino. There is a JavaScript compiler in interpreter, sorry, in Java. So we keep the same stuff. The Android application downloaded the same JavaScript from the CDN. In another case, we wrote 2 different teams, and they wrote the same unit test to keep the model aligned. They worked together on unit tests, and when they were, okay, this is the test that we need to pass. Okay, thank you. And the 2 teams were going to convert the test in the language, but to convert the test is easier, okay, than converting the code, because you just need to read it. And then when all the tests are green, they are okay with that. These are 2 different way of doing the same stuff that I witnessed.
So you're basically doing transpiling or manual transpiling. So there's keeping the models in sync. Yeah, I mean, that's the it depends decision many people have to do anyway, right? Always think about do it manually or automate stuff.
So you would say this is either a short kernel conformist relationship between the 2 models of the bounded context in that case, or was this within a bounded context or between bounded contexts?
Yeah, it was in my case. It was exactly in the same bounded context.
Okay,
exactly
and
then it was exactly the same model. Okay, because you have a mobile application and the front end application. They were doing actually the same stuff. Okay, as a model point of view.
Yeah. Christina just provided a great example in chat, saying in the last company they had one set of BDD tests, I assume with Cucumber or something like that. And then they were implemented and executed by the API at first, and then by the app afterwards. So synchronizing the behavior by building everything test-driven and having a language that gets transpiled or translated into both programming languages. That's also a really good way. So
We had some tests for the app only. If we had some things which were not really business rules, but get it nicer or make it. You cannot go in the API back and forth, and you can do this in the website. Of course, it's a different behavior. But most of the basic tests, or for every story, every new discussion, we had this question: okay, which are the business rules? Which are our constraints? And these were one set of tests without including any words like font size or front-end stuff or back-end stuff, but the pure behavior.
Yeah.
And this was great.
And I think that's what I try to do. One of my key heuristics in DDD is always remove technical wording like create, read, update, delete, backend, front-end. You might end up with a bounded context as just purely front-end code, right? But that's a solution detail. Don't call it blah, blah, blah website, please. Yeah. Call it what it is. Call it like blah, blah, blah journey, or call it what it is, what you're trying to solve, and not the
ticket reservations.
Yeah.
My control question was always, which customer would say the viewport should be this and that?
Yeah, good question. Yeah, I've worked a few years with Roman Saxi on front ends, and we've built a .NET software, right? So going into functional programming with F# over a while, we found Fable, which is kind of like a Babel for F#. So it transpiles into JavaScript. And we actually started building our front end and our back end in F#, so we could actually share the model. It wasn't just like a transpiling where we then continued building stuff in JavaScript, but you could actually write one code and use it on both sides. And that felt really great. But we figured something was really off. And that is, I mean, it is obvious if you think about it, but it caught us by surprise at some point. You have business rules, and those business rules should be met in the front and the back, right? So assuming that you are in the same context or in a similar context with the same behavior. But validation in the front end is different than validation in a context where multiple users are involved. I'm forgetting the English word for that. Competitive? No. Yeah, well, I'll figure it out later. But yeah, so if you have rules on the back end where multiple users are involved, the rules change, or they are slightly different, or they are only encompassing the rules from the front end, but also adding more rules. So really starting to compartmentalize your business logic into smaller and smaller aggregations or functions, basically, that could be composed. That was kind of the way where we went to in the end, language-wise. So building smaller and smaller aggregates when you are still thinking object-oriented, or building composable smaller functions to really build the same language that is usable front and back end, no matter where you are, and everything is written in the same language. It's kind of a beautiful state to be in, but of course, it's completely coupled to a specific framework and a specific language that you can use. So it's very, very specific use case. But after that, I realized every language that does not build a JavaScript transpiler is losing a lot of opportunities. So finding or building your own really good JavaScript transpiler that builds, I don't know, React components or so, to make you able to just describe your business behavior in your own language and then have it also work on the website or in the front end, or just use Node. Yeah, just use JavaScript in the back end. Yeah.
Yeah. So I think one thing, sorry, Francesco, before you continue, and there was something in YouTube. And I think one thing to make it clear is a bounded context can contain front-end technology or back-end technology or both.
Yeah.
I mean, all three are solutions and accidental complexity anyway. So because we got this question going into, isn't that coding on behalf of enforcing DDD ideas? By creating a backend to serve the domain implemented in the front-end view instead of letting the front-end use different endpoints. But yeah, that's really as you said before, Marco, a different, well, that's how I see it. That's a technology choice that DDD doesn't have anything to say per se.
Yeah,
right?
Yeah, I totally agree.
Yeah. So sorry, Francesco, I wanted to
just a word
answer something in YouTube.
Just a word of warning about transpiling to JavaScript or on transpilers in general, because as a front ender, I can say that it gives you a false state of serenity. An example, for example, if we work in TypeScript, okay, the TypeScript is really loved by front-enders today because they say, okay, I have, wow, I have types in JavaScript, okay. In reality, that code is completely run in real time. So for example, if you create your perfect model that came from a JSON, and that JSON it's broken from the server, your application will break constantly. And the sad thing is that if you think that your model is perfect because you designed it with types, you completely forgot about data validation from the JSONs. I can say that from a real world because I made the same mistake, and I see this mistake in all around the code that I saw in the last couple of years.
So this triggers two things for me. I mean, you're totally right. This is a big problem. And Kenny was hinting at that in the beginning of the chat, saying ports and adapters also could belong into the front end, right? So having the same mental model to orthogonally separate your infrastructure from your business behavior, domain behavior, also holds true in the front end. So when you get a JSON message, and the JSON could be broken, right? But in your domain model, in your front end, your domain model needs a specific type with a specific format and specific data in valid states. You need to have a mapper, something like a repository that can actually take those JSONs and make them either valid value objects or not. And yeah, this is when we were working with Fable, so the F# Babel transpiler. That's something that worked really well because of the Elmish architecture. There was a model view update pattern, and the only in or output of the whole architecture in the front end is messages. So you get messages when you start loading your application, and it's basically a React component which has all the Elmish architecture inside them. So you have a functional domain-driven application in the front end that is encapsulated in a React component, and behind that you can have an API that is doing mapping between that and the rest of the application in the front end or the back end servers, right? So it's an abstraction. The domain model doesn't know where it's living. It doesn't know if it's running in a test backend server or in a real website or in a headless browser in a C# application. It doesn't know that. It doesn't need to know. All it knows is, hey, these are my messages, and there can never be messages in a legal state because you wouldn't allow them to go into your model. You need to filter that before you put them into the domain, because there is no domain user, as Christina would say, there is no stakeholder who would actually talk about broken null values in an object. That's not how business people think or users think.
Sometimes they do.
No. But those are broken people.
Yes. So a question here. Let's say this is for you, Francesco, as well. So something I've been struggling with, right? So like aggregate goes into consistency. It can be done in front end, right? Which is fine. But let's say you have one bounded context. You have a front end and a back end. Let's call it like that as a solution, right? Because you want something to happen. I don't know. You choose for that way. And you need to keep the front end and the back end language in sync, because that's what we want in DDD, right? That's what you were just talking about transpiling. But you also have then sometimes duplication of business constraints, right? Constraints that happen in your in the DD objects in your, let's call it backend, right? Where you have like aggregates that persist state to the backend, but then that same rule needs to come back in the front end. So that's a lot of keeping things in sync, right? How do you cope with that? How do you deal with that? What are your heuristics to keep that in sync?
Yeah, but they are not really in sync. Because when you're talking about a front-end application, you're always talking about mono-user application, like Marco said before. It's you and your user. On the other hand, when you're talking on the backend, you're talking with the multitude of data. So in a real-world case scenario, they are very similar, but not equal. So they are not duplicated, okay? They are different nuances of the same model, if you want. Because
doesn't that make them separate bounded contexts anyway? Because they're non-consistent. Yeah, so I'm just getting it, right? Because I say they're nuanced models. For me, that's two separate models. So two separate bounded contexts.
They are talking about the same stuff, but from different point of view. And they are using the same language. But the point is that when you are writing your model, The fact that the application where you're going to run it is mono user usually have some kind of, like I say, some differences in real code, okay? So you have, like Marco said, probably you have your model split in smaller and smaller modules because you need to give feedback to the user on every single input, for example. Imagine that you are validating an order, okay? A classic DDD problem. On the backend, you probably will validate the entire order. On the front end, before validating the entire model also on the front end, you probably had made a lot of smaller validation while the user is using creating the model. Another point, for example, when you are talking about event-driven architecture for front end and back end, an heuristic that I can give you is that the number of type of events, not the number of events, but the types of events, is 10 times bigger on a front-end application. Because, for example, I make an example, okay? On the backend, you have order created, okay? You have order created also on the front end, but before that, sometimes you also have a lot of smaller events, also local, okay? They are not bounded to the model, but they are just bounded to the UI. That is, for example, a wizard, or are depending of the UI that you're creating. These simple differences.
Can you give me an example of those events?
For example, header created for the order. Okay, you don't save the header, but you are created it in the UI, and you need to go next. So they are not model events, so you don't send them to the server like I showed you before. But if you want to make your UI move with events, you have a lot of more events.
Okay.
So, okay.
Sorry, I didn't want to interrupt you. I'm just, I'm getting nervous here. So there's a distinction between domain events, of course, and UI events, right? So you have button clicked or header created or mouse moved or anything like that. As long as it's not a semantic meaning to the domain, but just to control your application, I'm totally with you. Those events don't matter for the domain model. But if it's something that the domain cares about, let's say you create a header for an order, not like a UI header, but you really create, there's a letter and there's a name and you create that letter, that header. That's a domain event. It doesn't matter if you actually send it to the backend or the front end or whatever, but if your bounded context is purely in the front end and your bounded context is about creating the order and doing everything, and then the communicating external event would be order or shopping cart has been ordered or something, then of course you have domain events more in that front end part than in the back end. But it's still domain events, and still I would like to get away from this dichotomy saying there's a front end and the domain. Those are domain events, and your bounded context just happens to be purely in the front end.
Yeah, I agree with you. What I was trying to say is that if you have the header created event, okay, it's a domain event, and you need to validate these events with an aggregate or invariant, okay? The same code, probably, you will have the same code in the backend.
But why?
Because you need to validate the order as a whole, for example, because you have one post as a REST API, okay? You can have a technical bound, okay, a vertical gate that you have to solve at a point, okay? If you have, for example, a post REST API to create all the big order, okay, you will have to validate the entire order on the backend.
Yeah.
This is what I was trying to say. Sometimes you have this kind of asynchronous.
Yeah, so that's the problem with having web front-end technology. It's sent to the customer so they can manipulate it and put it themselves in a state, in a, how do you call it again? In a state.
Illegal state.
In an illegal state.
Yeah.
So front-end is manipulatable,
yeah.
while, right, the backend, so.
Yeah, but that's exactly the thing that I talked about before when we said we have validation logic, right? There is a domain behavior in the front end.
Yeah, it's
in
still
the bounded
behavior.
context that is customer facing, and there is also behavior that is similar, that is in the fulfillment area of in the fulfillment bounded context. And if there is the exact same business rule, it's not sufficient to just check it in one context and then just trust in the other. But it has nothing to do with front or back end. But if you just think about, if you role play your domain, right? If I go into your office and say, hey, Kenny, somebody ordered this, and you're not checking anything, you're just saying, great, let's just send it to the customer. Like, no, that's not how your business would operate. What you would do is, if I give you an order, you would check if that order makes sense, and if the customer is who he pretends to be, and then fulfill the order. But you don't care about the details of how this order came to be. That's part of the other bounded context. So you can have shared behavior, and that's what Francesco said, right? You need to somehow transpile your behavior, or you need to do checks, or like Christina's team did, do some kind of BDD test-driven development, so you have the exact behavior on both sides. But even if the front-end part, or as I would call it, the customer-facing bounded context, even if that messes up, your business still doesn't suffer, because your bounded context that does fulfillment still has a sanity check based on the same behavior. And yeah, Christina was just writing, the front end is easier hackable, right? Because everybody can just open browser, hit F12, start editing stuff. And you know that. That's the same thing as if you have a bank with open doors. If you know that's the case, you need to find ways to protect your business anyway. So yeah, do a double check before you fulfill the order. That's a domain-driven, sensible thing to do. That is from analyzing the business behavior without talking about technology in any way. And then usually it becomes JavaScript in the front end and Java in the back end or something like that. But yeah.
Is it then, so going into that again, to my point, if you look at bounded context and consistent language, I'm using in my front end, I'm using a type, right? For instance, in this case, order. And in the backend, I'm using that order, but it's a different order from a model perspective. It's a different language. So if it's ambiguous, isn't it two different bounded contexts?
Yeah, this is where it becomes really nitpicky. So this is where I was screaming, it depends 10 minutes ago.
I'm nitpicky now,
because
I love that. That's what the pattern says, right? The pattern says a consistent language with a model for a purpose.
I have a philosophical answer for that. So it's 2 or 3 steps. The first thing is, of course, as long as you have the exact same behavior, guaranteed, right? If you have a transpiler like Fable, that's one model. So it's one bounded context, and you don't need to separate. If you do a transpiling by hand, then the behavior could be slightly different, but conceptually it's the same. I would still call this a bounded context because it's one mental model, and the team that is building it understands we have solution parts in our server system that is running for multiple users, and we have part of the solution in the user-facing front end, but we are building this one mental model, and an order looks like this and behaves like this. Then there could be technical bugs, right? Your JavaScript could fail for different reasons than your Java code. And that's a technical bug, and that's fine. It's still one mental model with different implementations underneath, but there's one model. But I totally
now
agree.
It gets, now it gets interesting, because that was the question, right? Is it easy for onboarding? And I think if you look at both codes and you talk about the same shared mind model, Marco, I agree with that. So I like that approach, right? If I look at both codes, they relate. You just need to keep them in sync.
Yeah, but
that's
now
your
comes
only
the
challenge.
But now comes the it depends part, because now you have 2 different code bases with one idea behind it, one mental model. And for now, your organization ensures it's always clean, coupled, the same. It's one mental model. But imagine now your team consists of 3 people who are really fit in JavaScript and React, and 3 people who are really fit in Delphi and building the backend system. So, and the team grows and grows and separates over time, locally or time zone or whatever, pandemic, and then different cultures. Your team separate, and then your bounded context split in the front and back end. That could happen. All of a sudden, it becomes 2 different mental models using the same language a little bit right now, but already having different understanding of what it means. So in the front end, the behavior could change because the order in the front end is mutable, right? And in the back end, at some point, they say, no, an order is immutable because you just have to fulfill it. So all of a sudden it grows, or not all of a sudden, but it grows over time into different behaviors. And this is something where team topologies or even bounded context mapping become a temporal thing. every model you build is always temporarily correct. Right now, it's one mental model, but as soon as you have enough reason to split it into two mental models, make it two bounded contexts. If the actual behavior or the actual thing changes, it is not the same bounded context anymore.
Yeah, and I think, again, we're coming back to the point that if we split, we shouldn't split on back and front end, we should split on the model. So we need to, we need to burn these back end and front end, and this is what we're saying, right? But that's usually the anti-pattern that we're in. Just because it's easily splittable because they're sort of like two models, but they're not, and you split them on the models, we should talk about the models and not, again, about front end and back end teams. So we should remove that from our language and keep, and that's one thing that DDD keeps saying, right? If your model changes, be mindful of it.
Yeah. The biggest problem here is when you say we, who do you mean? The we is really hard. If you mean we, the 9 people here in the chat, all DDD aficionados, fans of DDD, right? That's totally easy. We can change our mindset just by wanting it to, because we understand. I don't know, I've seen it about 100 different domains or so, and the biggest problem is not that the domain experts don't understand it might be the same model. The biggest problem is what Francesco was hinting at the beginning. In the companies that produce software, you usually have a culture of, this is our design team, they do design, and they make HTML great, or CSS, or whatever people use today. And this is our domain team, they understand code and build the backend. And if that's your company culture, it's really hard to change that up from the bottom up, from understanding, oh, we should be one team. Well, we're not. So taking the reality into account, this is where the temporal nature of bounded context mapping is so important, right? Your team structure right now is very different from what you think makes the most sense for your customer. And everyone who has power to change that should push into the direction of, let the design of the software be driven by the domain, which is kind of in the name. So actually starting to make more cohesive teams, to have cross functionalities, thanks, Christina, welcome to silos, right? To get rid of the silos you've built just because you think that graphic designers and programmers shouldn't share a room, which is completely the opposite of what's true, in my opinion. I mean, I'm not proclaiming I know the truth here, but in my opinion, that's not the important distinction. So end of rant. That need to get out.
So is that how you see it as well, Francesco? Do you have anything?
Yeah, I completely agree. The point is that we can't solve it with code if we have a team problem. It's impossible, okay? And sometimes it's also okay if the two model drift, because like Christina said, they can evolve differently, okay? It could happen. And it's also completely fine. You only need to be aware if you become a different bounded context. Perhaps it start using a different language too, because the front end is always user-faced. It's almost never business-faced, okay? Because the problem that you are solving are the problem of the users all the time. And so with time, what could happen is that they become two different bounded contexts. But I think that you cannot solve everything. Sometimes you also need to let go, okay? They are different bounded contexts, okay? We remap them. If the code is top-notch, in any case, I mean, it's tested, continuous delivery, or whatever, I can live with that. But we need to remap the context because we need clarity. Because if I think that they are the same meaning, but they are not, we have a problem.
And I think you make an important point. I try to teach people is usually we have the communication straight to the unit of deployment, right? So let's say you have a unit of deployment called the reservation system or something. Then we talk about the reservation system, but we should shift our talking, and that leads to backend and front end again, right? Because we're talking about technical solutions, but we need to shift our communication to that of bounded context. That is our gateway, and it doesn't matter if it's front end or back end, but that's the way we should talk. And that's what DDD, in my opinion, is the big added thing, right? We talk about bounded context. Your backlog is also talking about the bounded context instead of what system should we change, right? Your user stories are, I need to do this in that journey, or I need to do this in that bounded context, not I need to do this inside the user story. You will have implementation or that, oh, that means we need to touch upon this and this system. But I think it starts there. It's changing the communication towards models and bounded context instead of unit of deployments or front end and back end, because then front enders and back enders talk in models instead of the technology they write them. I think that's a clear thing.
Yeah,
that's my rant usually. Stop talking in units of deployments, period.
It is the same issue with GraphQL, because you don't talk. You just make you make a huge API interface and say, don't talk to me, take from here what you want. This is a total disconnect, and everybody is frustrated and everybody's working twice. Because
and similar for the event queues, Christina, right? I dumped it on my event queue. Just take it, go.
Exactly. It's the same.
I mean, this is.
I want to say a word about. Sorry, Marco. I was.
Go ahead.
Okay. A word about GraphQL, because it's quite interesting. Because GraphQL is born, I think, in Facebook, like one source of truth for all the mobile application. Okay, so I think we are talking about 50 front-end different application, and people use it when they have 4 developers, okay, in total. So the point is that it's usually unuseful, because just prepare me a dedicated endpoint to solve my problem, but I need to talk with you, and I don't want to talk with you. That's what GraphQL is trying to solve.
Yeah, so that's
I
what
I disagree. It is not GraphQL's issue. It is the people.
Yeah.
We used GraphQL everywhere and never even thought about this solution until 1 year later. I heard everybody was ranting about GraphQL, but it isn't GraphQL.
Oh, so that pattern didn't happen with microservices, and that pattern.
It's the same. It's not GraphQL.
That's the whole point of starting with a model first, right? Start to understand what are you actually solving for which stakeholders, and the way you separate your bounded context depends on what you're trying to optimize for, right? There is not a natural boundary, like it's a design decision. And if you separate your teams alongside a certain boundary, and you understand in your model there is respective behavior between you, either I'm telling you to do something or I'm asking you for information and you need to provide it within a certain amount of time or with a certain quality. All of those things are part of our mental model of how we provide a good solution for the customer's problems. And then we implement it. And then GraphQL is a wonderful solution if you have a problem where this fits. It's like with every tool. If you have a tool that fits your problem's nature or structure, well, that's a great tool. If you try to chainsaw your hammer, your nail out of the wall, that's might be overused or might be wrong. So
and this is the thing I always see, and I try to mention in one of the talks I give, is people choose one strategy.
Yeah,
but it's never one strategy. You can do microservices, you can do serverless, you can do strategic monoliths, all at the same time.
Totally.
At the same time. It doesn't matter. You can do event driven, you can do REST, you can do GraphQL
at the same time.
If you at the same time, you can do outside in testing and inside out unit testing at the same time. Just choose when you pick one over the other, because both have pros and both have cons. And that's what I usually see.
The trade-off here is, of course, team maturity, right? If you have a mature team where everybody is high-level skilled, thinking about the customer needs first, understanding all the options and making sensible trade-offs, and also understanding their own emotions in a psychological safe way to communicate and all that, if all that is a given, that's the best thing you can do. You can really build the optimal system. If you, of course, are in a company where you have time pressure, everything needs to work last week and everything has to be, of course, highest quality, and there are 15,000 different stakeholders and you can't communicate with them, but then you still need to build something. At some point, being defensive and just building up some kind of GraphQL interface saying I put it on the event queue, right? Those things are the natural follow-up of a broken company culture, and not per se of a bad programming technology or something. Yeah.
Question from the audience. So we get this question is being asked a lot. And I got an answer from a classic DDD point of view, right? When DDD is too much for a project, question mark. So you model where you want to model a lot and where you don't, right? So we have the core supportive and generic.
Yeah.
How much would you use in your presentation, what you just did, Francesco? When will it be too much to use this approach in, and how far would you go in what you just showed us in your code, Francesco? So when it's too much to use it, what would you use and what won't you use in certain situations?
I think it's too much when you have just standard validation models, okay, a form validation model or something like that. When you don't have a complex UI, a complex journey. Also because I think that it's easily to introduce later point in the application. So my suggestion is to start simple, because in JavaScript it's easy to make a mess. Okay, it's very easy to lose control. And I'm saying that from a JavaScript point of view, okay? So my suggestion is to, if you choose a framework, keep the framework in mind for a while, see how it goes, and then introduce some DDD after a while. Before it's too late, but not from the beginning. Because it could get messy if your team is not ready to do that. Because like I said before, they are two different words, okay? So if you introduce some DDD concept like aggregates and a team that only working in React until the day before, it could become hard, okay? So it depends on the size of the problem you're solving, the complexity of the problem, and the maturity of your team. This is the main pain point. It needs a very, very mature JavaScript developer to start implementing this stuff.
Yeah, I think this is one of Kenny's sticks, right? Having a heuristic collection here that you can use. So there is no best practice and there is no obvious perfect solution. But one of the great heuristics I found in the past is if you have a front-end team that is completely not used to working with back-end teams or with domain models in general, is have one person from the adjacent bounded context, from the back-end team with already domain-driven experience, become part of the front-end team. So cross-pollination of those ideas, because I don't need to be able to write JavaScript to be able to guide you to separating your domain model in the front-end, right? That's one of the easiest parts, is to look at something and asking smart questions to get people to see why this is not the obvious best choice and starting to separate technology from domain model. That's
already a heuristic in itself. If I cannot read your domain model in your code, doesn't matter which technology. If I don't understand or relate to it, if I know the domain and if I don't relate to it, then okay, something is up.
Yeah. I've had a little glimpse of that when I was looking at Francesco's code before, because the domain model is pretty expressive, but you used weasel words like repository or aggregate. I was like, why is the word repository popping up in the code? That shouldn't be there, because a customer repository is basically representing the customers, right? You could name it customers and have the language be more domain driven.
Oh yeah, okay. I never talk. Okay, I do that on purpose. And sometimes I enforce this code style because I want people to start thinking about repositories. I understand. I usually call it customers and customers API when I want to talk about API, okay? So the service, I talk about customers. Repository, I call APIs usually because it's an API.
And it's the endless discussion. This is an endless discussion I get a lot, right? Well, it's a repository. Why don't name it a repository? Because then I know what technical approach it is. And then others will say, well, then it's polluting your domain language, because then the next meeting you will say it's a customer's repository, and you don't want that with so
I know. I think that we never find a solution. But in this particular code, I made it on purpose because I want to be clear what I'm talking about.
Makes total sense.
And sometimes I also made it in a real project when I want people to start talking about repositories because they need to start understanding the consequences of using a repository. But usually I don't like it. I prefer customers as a whole.
Yeah, the thing is, right, everything's a trade-off. And I mean, this is something that we always accumulate towards at the end of every virtual DDD meetup, kind of. Everything's a trade-off and it depends on so many things. So there is no obvious best way, right? Calling a customer repository or customers both have great upsides and downsides. If you want to teach people, and if specifically if you want to transform a group of front-end developers into domain-driven thinkers, yeah, calling it repository to make things explicit is a great way to make those concepts explicit in code. If you have a really mature DDD team, you don't want to read a story like Harry first name Potter last name person walked action along street infrastructure. Like that's not how the story flows, right? You want to read the pure business language to understand the novel. Yeah.
Yeah, and it's still something I would use. Naming is hard, so I'll name it wrong first, or quirky, or let's just name it weird, and then we can change it later, probably, if you decouple things correctly. So naming it first repository, and eventually in a week later you remove it. I've done that.
Yeah.
I've done that recently, actually. First name it repository and really remove it in a review. Then someone reviewed it and they say, Kenny, why would you use repositories? That's not fun.
And that's a really cool thing I've seen in the past is front-end teams are more prone to building transformable software anyway, because technology in the front end changes way faster than in most backends. So building models, renaming stuff to deeper insight, those things have a hard time to get adopted in many backend teams because people want to build a domain and it should work forever, right? And that's not how the world works, but getting them into a transformative mindset where software is never a product, it's always a changing process that is evolving. That's harder for backend teams. And actually, this is where the front-end teams have an easier time because they anyway need to change every few months because technology evolves.
Yeah, this is a thing that I learned as a front-ender. I was a Java backend developer, okay? So right now, I'm a completely different Java developer. I don't think too much about a lot of stuff. I just go with the flow and some tests. But this is stuff that you learn with JavaScript because JavaScript is always a mess. You learn to live dangerously.
I see Christina nodding. Yeah, so you're always in a state of chaos. So you're always on your toes. So you're battling some of your biases.
Yeah,
always keep the chaos fear up.
Cool.
Okay, I think. Well, I don't think I have. Much to add or questions. Is there someone still from the audience? I don't see any other questions. Well, that's the one thing that popped up, right? Is this type of approach easy for onboarding developers in the project? It can be, right? It
depends on the background or the background of the developer that you are onboarding. If they are, if this is somebody that knows about TDD, they are on board on day one. If they are, I know, some junior developer that just saw some React code, it could be different. It could be harder because you are working in a way that is different from what the framework tells you to do sometimes, and it could be harder.
Yeah, and I think what Christina says, it could make it easier because you tell the story. And that's what I like. So usually when I onboard someone, I start with the documentation. I show some event storming. So naming and domain concepts start popping up, right? And then we go to the code and then one-on-one it's there. Even though it's structured differently, people start already seeing, yeah. And that's actually the pure, I think, core of DDD is that you want that epiphany, right? I see the conversation, I see that, I see in your event storm documentation, I see it, and I see it in the code. And I think then the onboarding would, is really nice, I guess.
Yeah, but this is true just if they can read models in your language. This is what I mean, because a JavaScript developer, a React developer, okay, a junior React developer is not accustomed to read pure JavaScript file in that way. So they don't focus on your story, they will focus on the code. They will focus on what the heck it's written down here, why it's not in the React state, for example. And so, you know, your story just, poof, they are concentrating on the problem and not on the solution.
Yeah, I mean, that's a cultural problem, right? That's always one of the hardest things when people really want to think in technology and you really want them to understand the model and helps finding a solution or proposing good solutions. That's always like a diametral working forces. And it takes a lot of time and patience to get people from where they are to where they would be really helpful. But if the company, if the team in general is very domain driven, then it is fairly, let's not say easy, but it's pain-free to get someone from the outside who thinks totally in technology and to say, look, all of your expertise is really wanted. We need that. We need to have a sanity check on our tech, but this is a story. And then you spend way more time with sticky notes and spoken words than with actually looking at code. I would not start looking at a domain model in code when I know that someone is focused on, oh, this is this pattern and this is the wrong API. Like, stop thinking about that. If someone is code focused, don't show them code first. Start talking about the domain first, and then slowly expose them to more and more code, and then go back to the model so they see why they're doing everything, and make transparent what you're doing. Cool. Right? Don't do it by accident. Tell them we're trying to teach you the domain before we go into technology because reasons. Yeah.
And that's why I love the ports and adapters as well, because that decoupling of the two, right, really helps. Where I recently we were making a connection to Cosmos DB, and I can say, well, here's your project, which is an adapter side, just go for it. And of course, experimentation. And then we can just, in 1.5 hours, we could just refactor that code and we didn't touch any other stuff. So similar to the domain model where you can make these isolation, right? So here is your place, just go. And then later on, we can more easily refactor because we made that decoupling straight. So this is a much easier way than having a really big unboundaries project, right? Where you see no boundaries, then it's more frightened for a junior to change something. But if you really could decouple that, and you can really say, well, you want to take this bit and just implement it here and just go nuts, try to solve it. And then together you can refactor it, because then they will learn, you will learn, you both learn, bonus points. Okay. Well, one last question. Would a task-based UI expose domain language and operations?
Can you repeat, please?
Yeah. So,
would a task-based UI expose domain language in operations?
I don't know. I need to think about it. Quietly. No, I can't get now. I think I'm also tired to answer the question now.
Okay, so I'd say whoever asked that questions, go to Francesco Strazzullo on Twitter and post that question publicly, and then you'll get an answer once he's awake again, had his coffee in the morning.
Yeah. So, I'm really sorry, but I'm quite tired now to try to answer that now.
So before we wrap up, could you share the GitHub link of the code so I can share it on YouTube as well? And well, if there's no further questions,
Give me a moment. I will try to.
Yeah, we'll put that on the YouTube. Yeah, put it on the chat.
Also on Zoom. Yeah.
Yeah, got it. So here we go. Sharing it on YouTube. Thank you.
Perfect.
So that's a wrap.
Thanks a lot.
Thanks a lot. It was a really interesting discussion. I learned a lot again to think about this. Thanks for the rest who joined in. Thanks for the people on YouTube. And before we leave, Marco has a nice thing to share before we leave, right? Something with an open space.
There will be an open space for domain-driven designers in Berlin on October 21st and 22nd. Our former conference, Kandinsky, which has been going on for 4 years now, we paused it due to the pandemic last year, and this year we have 100 tickets. I mean, some of them have already been sold, so if you want to join, speed up. But we have 100 tickets. It's in person only. There will be no videos. It's an open space. So you build the agenda, whatever you want to talk about, workshop about. We have a lot of rooms. We have free sticky notes for everybody. And it will be 2 days of collaboration. The only condition is you have to be vaccinated or recovered because of health risks. We don't want anybody who's just tested, and we will be very rigorously with that. But everyone is welcome to learn, to collaborate, and go to kandinsky.com. We'll post the link in the chat and on the YouTube as well. Christina here has the first ticket already, so she's getting the prime spot, first row. And yeah, happy to see everybody there.
Yep, great, thanks. And see you there as well for our next virtual DDD meetup. So for everyone listening, if you, like Francesco, want to talk about a topic, give a presentation, just have a, well, whatever you want, everything is open to share. We can record it, we cannot record it, that's all up to you. But if you want to just talk with people on a topic on DDD, please reach out to us. And this was it for tonight. Thank you, Francesco, for your time and for your effort.
Perfect.
Thank you for the
Bye-bye.
great
Thank you to
dialogue.
you.